Well, hello, dear students. This is our last family, the Cervidae, or the deer. Every deer on the planet is in the family Cervidae. So here's two Asian species of deer. I took both these pictures in India. That's a sambar deer on the left, and a spotted deer, or axis deer, on the right there. And I just added that one because it's kind of cool. We think of spots as being only on fawns, and that is a species that retains its spots throughout its entire life. Let's start with the most familiar one. Let's start with the white-tailed deer. And I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to give you a few things that you don't know about white-tailed deer, or maybe some important pieces here without getting too super deep into it. Here's a fun fact. Do you know that white-tailed deer change color? Yeah, I have an awful lot of people that see deer their entire life and don't recognize that in the summer, white-tailed deer have this very reddish coat. So I took this picture in Virginia, but this deer would be the same here. The summer coat on a white-tailed deer is very thin. There's fewer hairs to it, and it's very light in color. If we jump to a deer that's actually molting from its summer coat into its winter coat, we're back in New York State now, and I know the face is a little bit blurry here, but this is a great picture. I put a camera trap aiming straight down on a deer trail. This sort of looks like I'm in my tree stand, and taking a picture of a deer with my cell phone. But you can see this darker brown color. This is what deer molt into, and she is shedding her lighter summer coat here. So this is probably a September photo, if I remember accurately, and dramatically shows the difference in color for white-tailed deer. White-tailed deer are found in the 48 contiguous states throughout all of Mexico, most of Mexico, and the lower half of Canada. It's truly a North American species, and it is incredibly popular among hunters, so much so that if you watch hunting TV, if you go into a sporting goods store that specializes in hunting gear, so much of the market is driven by what white-tailed deer hunters need or want, which are two different things for sure. So they're a huge economic driver. They provide income through hunting and all the things associated with hunting. They also cost money, economic loss through agriculture and forest damage and auto insurance claims. We'll get into some of that later. Let's talk about what's typical for a white-tailed deer. When biologists use the word typical, what they mean is what are antlers supposed to look like? They're not talking about the size, they're not talking about the mass of them, but white-tailed deers are typically one main beam and then tines that come off of that main beam. You see what I'm talking about? So those are two interesting words that go along with antlers: beam and tine. Tine is like on a fork or a rake. I don't know why I'm blanking on that. Sorry. When I call this animal typical, I don't necessarily mean that it's typical size of the deer that I see. This is an unusually large one, but I mean that it's the typical whitetail pattern. Now, a hunter would call this a 10 pointer because each one of the tines counts as a point, and here in the east, we count both sides. Out west, they would call this a 5 pointer because they only look at one antler. It's got to be different. And if someone told me that they were hunting and they shot a 10 pointer, most people would be impressed by that because 10 is a lot of number of points. But let me show you this guy. This was also photographed on my property with a camera trap. This is also a 10 pointer. And I wouldn't be bragging about this deer. I certainly would be telling everybody I shot a 10 pointer, and I would let them imagine this one. But just laying out the number of points isn't the whole story when it comes to whitetails. I only use this picture because this was an antler found within 10 minutes of the college. So somewhere near FLCC, this buck lived. And didn't get shot during the hunting season, dropped his antler, and one of my students actually found it. So please don't forget that antlers are shed every year, and every antler from every deer that you're going to see in my PowerPoint grew in one season. This would still be called a typical antler for a whitetail because it's one main beam with tines coming off of it. They usually don't have this many tines this close together, this tall, but it still is typical because it's one main beam with tines coming off it like a rake or a candelabra or a menorah. When do they start losing their antlers? Well, I'm sorry, I read that wrong, didn't I? They start losing their antlers as early as December. They can lose them as late as April. And I've seen deer in April with antlers. But check out this date down here. This is March 30th. This is almost an April Fool's joke right here. So there are some whitetail deer that will keep their antlers on pretty much until the new antler growth starts pushing them out. And there are others that drop them much sooner. So in January, February, March, you might see deer that have no antlers, but it could be because they dropped them already, or it could be because they're does and never grew any. The fact that deer have antlers that fall off can have a different biological meaning than animals that have horns that don't fall off. Now, I stole this picture off the internet here, and old Buckethead here is probably very grateful that he is a deer instead of an animal with horns, because eventually one of those antlers is going to fall off and that bucket's going to come off of his head. But until then, he's running through the woods. He's his own sort of deer whistle, making that weird noise as he goes. Let me show you some world-class whitetail deer. So these are all mounted specimens at the Cabela's in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Again, this would be what's called a typical whitetail, a main beam and then tines coming off of them. Since we've learned the word tine, I'd like to teach you another word, and that's called a drop tine. So sometimes antlers grow odd, and a tine, instead of growing up, grows down. So hence the name drop tine. And then all these little points that stick out here. Some people call them kickers. Some people call them stickers or stick points. There's no official term for those. Eventually, an antler gets so weird looking that we call it non-typical. So this is not a typical growth for a white-tailed deer. We call these kind of antlers palmate, like the palm of your hand. They look more like moose antlers. So this deer still can be considered a trophy and measured and all that stuff. It would just be in the non-typical category instead of the typical. In case anybody is thinking ahead to the test, I would tell you I have no interest in giving you a non-typical antler on the test and then, haha, you were supposed to magically know this was from a mule deer, sort of thing. Let's worry about what each of these guys look like typically. I showed you the spotted deer or the axis deer on the opening slide there. Our whitetails are also born spotted, but they lose those spots within a few months. So by the time they grow their winter coat in the fall in September, the spots are super faint or not visible at all. You know, it's almost fawn season. I am recording this in the first week of May, and whitetails in New York State, almost all of them are born in the month of May, but usually towards the back end of the month. And it won't be long before people start stumbling into fawns and then thinking that they're orphaned and they must rescue them. The reality is most of these fawns are actually stolen from nature, kidnapped, if you will, because of good whitetail mother leaves her fawn alone and hides. So she's relying on this animal's camouflage. I found this fawn in Naples. I was with a group of students and we were able to get very close and photograph it and then just slowly back away. We didn't try to touch it. We didn't mess with it. We didn't encircle it. And the deer just kept its ground. Let's talk about whether you can tell if this is a buck or a doe. This one's a doe, and I want you to look how clean the forehead looks. Here is a male fawn hiding in my backyard, and I can tell it's a male because it's got these two black marks on the top of the head. They look like those surprised eyebrows Everybody's got an Aunt Edna that shaves her eyebrows and paints them in too high. That is what's going on here. So those are the pedicels. That is where the antlers will grow from. If we go back, you can clearly see again that this is a female and that this is a male here. All the deer species in North America breed in the fall, and they all breed in a way that's synchronous. So if I can explain that without getting in too deep into the weeds, the white-tailed deer want to have a short breeding season so that they have a short birthing season. It doesn't work out perfectly because not all the does get pregnant during the same cycle, but the idea is to have most of the fawns born in a short window of time, and that way the predators can't find them all. So we know even fox, coyotes, dogs, black bears are all going to take fawns, but if there's so many of them all at one time, they'll get full and they won't be able to kill everybody. If we string them out and we have fawns all summer long, not only will some of them be too small in the wintertime, but the coyotes can keep picking them off all year as well. I do want to add one more vocabulary word here, and of all the tines on a deer, I only want you to know the name of one. The tine that's closest to the forehead here is called the brow tine. BROW. Your brow is your forehead. Okay? So in the fall, deer are breeding, and there's a few sign that they leave that are associated with the breeding season. The first is a scrape. So you have scrape and rub are two things that deer do. You might think scrape and rub are the same thing. Yep. Well, go to a massage and ask for a back scrape instead of a back rub, and I promise you that that will be a different thing. Scrape is what deer do on the ground. They will literally scrape away all the vegetation, make this fresh mark, and then they'll urinate in it. This is basically tinder for deer. This is a calling card. I am creating a scent on purpose, and then I'll come and freshen it, and I'll keep depositing my scent so that when a female comes into heat, she'll come, investigate it, put her urine in it, and then hang out. And when I come and check this, I can smell that she's been here, and then I'll go track her down. Here, let's have a look at it. Whoops, I got to change this from pen. My apologies. Oh, that's not how I change from pen. This is how I change from pen. Okay. So we're going to look at a video within a video. This won't take long. Aw, you stink. We are not going to look at a video within a video. I don't remember my Facebook password. It was just a video of a buck making this scrape. So he came up to it, he freshened it, and he scraped away all of the leaves that had accumulated and then squatted and urinated in it, and then off he went. How embarrassing. Here is a buck rub. So a rub is what a deer does with his antlers on a tree. And a lot of people look at these and they say, oh, this is how they scrape the velvet off when it itches. Well, there's very little of that that goes on. This is done when the antlers are hardened off, and most of this is a visual and scent sign. So they have glands in front of their eyes. We saw that on the bighorn sheep. They have glands on their forehead, and so when they rub against the trees, not only do they make that visual mark, but they also leave scent behind. I want to teach you one more color variety. We learned leucistic, we learned melanistic. Now I'd like to teach you piebald. Piebald is when you have patches of white where they're not supposed to be. So this is a piebald deer that was on my property 10 years ago. Actually, a guy a couple properties over shot it and had a full body mount made of it. It's a beautiful looking animal. And piebald can happen in any species. It's just pretty common in white-tailed deer. You should, in your lifetime, encounter a piebald deer. That would be a safe way to say it. If you're an observant person, I've seen just a couple in my life, but I've camera trapped a bunch as well. And because we live here in the Finger Lakes, maybe we should talk just a little bit about the quote white deer from the Seneca Army Depot. So the Seneca Army Depot is in my county here in Seneca County and is no longer an ammunition depot for the Army. The Army gave the property up, but when it was first made in the 1940s in response to World War II, they put up this huge fence, and the fence was to keep people out. They were storing ammunition in there. It also had the effect of keeping some deer inside. Well, white deer or leucistic deer are fairly common. I have read statistics that say 1 in 10,000 white-tailed deer are white, and clearly you have the chance to see 10,000 deer in your lifetime if you're paying attention. So the white deer was born inside the depot just naturally. It had nothing to do with inbreeding and nothing to do with nukes and radiation. And the commander of the depot said, "No one harm this deer. No, don't shoot the deer." And then a few years later, they had a couple more and a couple more, and so they were selecting for it. They were purposely protecting the white deer. So by the time the 1980s come about, when I started at FLCC, they had dozens of white deer in the depot. So many that they had to hunt the deer in there, so they'd have brown deer days and they'd have white deer days. We still have white deer at the depot today. They are, even though there is no depot anymore, the fence is still up, and the gentleman that owns it is trying to create a tourism industry around the white deer to have people come and see them. We would just call that leucistic, right? It's a white-tailed deer. It's not an albino. Albino means you have no pigment, and these guys have dark eyes. I have note the ears here because this deer is running away from me, but it's listening behind it. Do you see how the ears are pointed directly back at me? And sometimes I make this joke in class and nobody laughs. Today I won't know if you're laughing or not because you are home. But if you're a white-tailed deer, how much good does it do to raise that white flag, right? Like you're already completely white. So it's something that they do by instinct. Before you think that the only white deer are found in the Seneca Army Depot, I want to show you one from near Smith Road, which is just a mile or so from the college. I actually saw these two deer and jumped out of my truck, took this picture. Kind of was blocking traffic. I had somebody give me a one finger salute, so maybe I was a little bit not doing what I was supposed to. But this is a fawn, or more properly a yearling, because it's the new year. It's a springtime picture, and there's mom is the brown deer in the front here. So white deer get born all over North America, not just in the Seneca Army Depot. Turns out that melanism in white-tailed deer is incredibly rare. So it's easy to see a leucistic or a piebald white-tailed deer. It's very, very unusual to see a melanistic whitetail. And if this deer didn't have the characteristic whitetail rack and the white tail is dropped over here, you can see that the entire animal isn't black. It's just mostly black. If it didn't have that whitetail on that rack, I'd be hard pressed to prove that was a white-tailed deer. Some people think that the DEC manages white-tailed deer by what the insurance companies tell them to do. I can tell you, having worked with DEC for a long time, that I have a lot of confidence that that is just simply not true. They do respond. Oops, sorry. They do respond to complaints that people have, that interests have, like farmers and whatnot. But the auto industry is not the driver in New York State. Get it? Not the economic driver. But it is big business. In the United States, they figure that there's about 1.3 million deer car collisions per year with an average repair bill of over $4,000. So I don't want to dismiss the idea that white-tailed deer can be dangerous if there are too many of them. We've all seen dead deer on the road, and some of us have even hit deer or have had deer hit us. I had a deer run into the side of my truck one time. No discussion of white-tailed deer would be complete without talking about key deer. So I just took a group of students to South Florida in January, And here's 4 of the students that were on that trip. And here we are in the Florida Keys. So the Keys are a group of islands. Some of you listening to this may have been there. And the deer that live on those islands are white-tailed deer, but they're tiny. Look, this is an adult. I can tell it's an adult because it doesn't have spots. That's as big as that deer's ever going to get. And people feed them. So she was coming up looking for food, and we didn't give it any food, but we did take an awful lot of pictures there. I have some pictures that I stole off the internet just to show you how diminutive they are. Many of them are the size of dogs. This is a German Shepherd right here. Here, look at these adults. Look at the full racks on these. The guy on the right who's carelessly touching that endangered species, and the guy on the left that's at least keeping his hands to himself there. Like I said, a lot of these deer get fed by people, and to their detriment. It's not a good thing to do. Let's talk about mule deer now. So if we focus first on how to identify a mule deer, I'm going to tell you that mule deer got their name because of their large ears. They have big ears like a mule does. But the easiest way to identify a mule deer is by the front or the back. We're going to play a game of heads or tails. So if it's a buck, you're going to look for the typical rack on a mule deer, where the main beam forks and then the fork forks. The main beam forks and then the fork forks. A lot of forking going on. Do you see slingshots? Do you see the letter Y? Do you see knife handles? I don't care which one of those you use. Second, have a look at the tail. Mule deer look like they might have some weasel in their DNA. So mule deer have a white tail with a black tip at the end of it. Here, let's have a look. So here's a mule deer. I took this picture in the summer of 2019. Went to Utah with family, little family reunion there, and we were in a national park here, Zion, and I was able to get this picture. We're walking down the trail, and this deer is feeding right next to the trail. I took this picture with my cell phone, and the deer had no concern that we were there. That's how deer often are in a national park. The ears are larger than they are in white-tailed deer. This is Colorado, obviously a winter picture. This is a November picture. Look how big these ears look on this young deer. So they look comically large. They're extra big. It's like rabbit ears on this guy. So coming and going, we can tell that this is a mule deer. There's that white tail with the black tip. It does not look anything like a white-tailed deer's tail. I also want to say, like I did in the picture of the white deer at the Seneca Army Depot that was running away from me, notice the ears. This doe didn't mind me being here, but when she turned around to go feed on some other things, she wanted to make sure that I wasn't following too closely. There is a deer called the black-tailed deer. Black-tailed deer are simply a variety of mule deer. So this chart right here shows you that white-tailed deer, they're a thing. And then these two guys are the same species. And if you look at the antlers, that shows it. But if you ever saw a picture of a black-tailed deer, instead of having the black tip, it would have black the whole way up. Just a minor variation. And here's where they're found. So in this map, everything that's colored is a mule deer. But we looked at this when we did the sheep, right? You see that you've got different varieties, different subspecies. So Sitka black-tailed deer. If anybody watches Meat Eater, the hunting show, I only was able to watch a few episodes because they had a couple seasons on Netflix. He seems to go Sitka black-tailed deer hunting every year. And then here's the Columbia black-tailed deer. For some reason, the black-tail variety exists along the coast, and then inland here is where we've got the mule deer. So all the same species, just a couple different varieties. You can see that mule deer are a western species. And when I think of mule deer, I think of this kind of habitat. I have to tell you, this is one of my favorite pictures of mule deer. And I love taking pictures that are super close. Like I'm very focused on, field guide pictures of animals. But once in a while, I take a step back and take a scenic shot here. Boy, if I could just Photoshop that fence out. If any of you guys are smart enough, come help a brother out here. But these guys are just, this is their habitat. This is the rugged west. And look at the size of those ears. You can tell that this is a group of muleys, not a group of whitetails. Let's look a little bit more at behavior. So I told you all deer species breed in the fall. This is still November in Colorado, and I'd like you to look at the posture on this mule deer. I showed you a very similar posture on the bighorn sheep when he was challenging the other male here. So you stick your neck out, you put your chin up, and that really sets off your headgear, in this case antlers, in the bighorn sheep's case horns. And I think I got there after the rut for these guys. He's got some ears that are torn, and that's from battling other males. If you see the eye shine here, I am taking pictures and using my flash to help because it's not quite sunrise yet. I got up early, drove into the national park, had the place pretty much to myself. It's pretty cold in November, and add to that being there early, it was pretty cool. It was me and the animals, and he was just checking with all the does to see if any of them thought maybe it was still the breeding season. So there was a group of 3 does, and he went to each one of them, postured at each one of them, and none of them paid him any mind. So I think they had already all been bred. And voila, spring comes along, and you got babies. These are 2 mule deer bucks, as you can see. There's a little, I'm going to circle it and then I'm going to erase it. There's a little mark on the top of each of these guys' heads, and those are where the antlers are going to grow. This was a pair of fawns. This was in Wyoming, and obviously a summertime picture. There's a better shot of that guy, and you can see those 2 marks there. And who knows how impressive that rack is going to be at some point. But this is a time when fawns are very vulnerable. Earlier in the year, they're hiding. At this time of year, they're up and feeding and they're eating solids, but they're still pretty slow and they're still pretty naive. It's the early part of the spring when you come across those fawns that are just, they look like they're completely helpless. Yosemite National Park is in California, and that little family reunion thing that we try to do every July was to Yosemite that year, and we parked our car in a parking lot, and these signs were on many of the cars when we got back to the parking lot there. There have been baby deer hiding under vehicles in this parking lot, and I poked around a little bit and was able to find this guy. So he didn't come here on his own. The doe nudges this guy up, brings him to a place, and then nudges him down. And the idea here is in the parking lots, the cement stays cooler during the day than the forest floor does. So that's what they think is going on here. And they kind of hide them under vehicles, and the fawn is trained to just sit there. So it's possible to run one over. You got to be careful of that. I just thought that reflection made for a cool picture. Sometimes people ask me how I get my pictures. Now, I know this picture is not an award winner, but I'm very happy with the size of this mule deer. This thing is enormous. And you can see how fuzzy the antlers look. It's still summertime. They're still growing and rich with blood there. They haven't quite hardened off yet. And I would like to tell you that I had hiked into the wilderness for days and camped and was able to get this picture. But the truth is, if you just keep your camera with you all the time, you're going to bump into stuff. So I was driving along and saw this mule deer and just pulled over and took a picture. Hey, Rebecca Cabela's, let's have a look at some of the mule deer here. Look at that rack. I can't imagine. I can't imagine shooting a deer like this. Like I would love to, but I gotta believe I'd be super nervous about this. And we talked about how whitetail deer can be non-typical. All species that have antlers can be non-typical. So once again, I'm not going to try to fool you like this on the test. I just would like you to know that these things exist. Fair enough? Cool. All right, we're going to leave it at those two species. When you come back, our very last video will be elk, moose, and caribou.